also, by the way,
Right.
if no one ever takes these letters and does anything with them, like if I don't do it now, no one ever will, because his
Yes.
mother, his grandmother, these people are faded from history and largely gone forever, right? And so I want to honor their memory if I can turn it into a story, and it's very challenging kind of to pick a path. How does that resonate with you?
Well, that's what I did. So, well, I have one question though. Maybe you could
Yeah,
explain the Hellcats. The Hellcats.
it's a later generation of a fighter plane. So it was a prop plane, not a jet plane. It was World War II, and it was one that had more power. So when the U.S. and England worked together, they often said, "Hey, we have this engine, but our planes suck," and then America would be like, "Oh, our plane is awesome, but it's low on power," and so they
Okay.
would put these things together and maybe change the shape of a wing. And so the Hellcat's a plane that you see a lot if you watch Pacific War film stuff.
Okay.
Its wings would fold up
Oh
and it
yeah.
would sit
Okay.
like that, and so there's only a few planes that do that. And it was a brute. It was able to outperform a lot of planes. But by then, really, the tide had turned, right? And so having the better plane was helpful. But they were largely not obsolete, but they were going to be obsolete pretty quick because things were moving so fast.
Yes.
Jets were starting to come out. So
And
yeah,
I guess they used them primarily on the aircraft carriers.
yeah, yeah. They were great at that. That's why the wings folding up made
Yep.
them small footprint on the ship,
Right.
and they were very tough, and the Japanese were running out of pilots that were running out of materials. And so, yeah, it was one of the things that kind of told the tale of the tide turned in the war in the Pacific, because it was very hard to stop those things in mass.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, how does this resonate? You asked me, how does that resonate? You're wanting to do something maybe like myself. Well,
Yeah.
what happened? I was, my mother was one of the first female aircraft engineers
Okay.
during World War II. She worked for Curtiss-Wright.
Mm.
And I don't know I don't know who made the Hellcats, but Curtiss-Wright, I believe, was the biggest aircraft manufacturer for the U.S. government. And so my mother worked all of her life, and she worked in the
That's
aircraft.
a Hellcat.
Okay, there it is. Yeah, nice looking plane. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she worked for the defense industry all of her life, and she had a top secret clearance. And I never really knew what she did. I didn't, she didn't come home like a lot of families maybe and talked about whatever she was doing whenever she was doing it.
Sure.
And so about a couple years before her death, she mentioned that, I don't know, I used to take her out for lunch, and I would take her to some restaurant. She got to be a good restaurant critic. And one day we were talking at lunch about Nazis or something, I don't recall. And she said, "Well, I worked with a Nazi." And I didn't think much about it. She was probably 89 years old at the time. And I just thought, I didn't think much about it. And then after she passed in 2015, she left a lot of records, boxes of records. And then I found out that, yes, indeed, she worked with one of the scientists that came over from Germany after the Second World War on Operation Paperclip.
Right.
And
Right.
so I found out a lot of interesting things. And I thought, of course, this was top secret. Nobody, none of the Americans wanted to know we were putting these Nazis in our various industries and so on.
Right.
And so I thought that was interesting, and I thought I would write a book about that and these things. Then, as I started that book, my grandfather was a history professor. His last job was University of North Carolina. and I was living in Harper's Ferry at the time, and I was simply going to go to a town council meeting and talk about the history of Harper's Ferry and so on. And I I thought I would look up and see what if my grandfather had anything to say about that. So I went to the University of North Carolina records online, and I found these letters that were from my great uncle. My grandfather had placed them in the university for safekeeping back in the 30s, I think it was 30s. And I was just fascinated. I could barely read the letters because they're old and they're written
Yeah.
in script, cursive writing. And but I spent I don't know, couple weeks transcribing the letters, and then I was working. A friend of mine was helping me lay out the other book about my mother. And then I thought, well, this may be even more interesting. These letters may be more interesting than my mother. And I thought, well, I'll write a book about that. And then it was just kind of a organic thing that happened. And then we thought, well, the interesting thing, the Civil War letters had no response to them. And we only had the letters that Kendrick wrote back home to Georgia. And we thought, well, that would be interesting if I answered the letters from today. And that's how the whole thing kind of took place. It was just one of these organic things that just kind of happened. But at first, I thought it was a little strange, but then I thought, well, it's interesting. So in a way, you get two books for one in the book that we came up with called Remember Me.
Right.
Yeah.
Where that comes from a poem. You talk. It's not me pulling shit out of the top of my head. Like, this is in the book. You talk about this, but how did you come across that poem? Because it's poignant in the way that it talks about. I'll let you explain.
You're talking about the poem at the end of the book, which is
Yes.
a song, "When This Cruel War Is Over."
Yeah.
And I don't know all the origins of that, but the interesting thing was, and I read this from another book that was based on speeches that the captain of the Ninth Regiment made after the war. His name was George Hillier, and he later became the mayor of Atlanta, Georgia. But he would give these lectures, and somebody, I guess, thought it would be good if they recorded them in a little book. So I bought this little book, and it's really an interesting story, I think, because the Battle of the Wheat Field was on the second day of Gettysburg, and it happened in the afternoon. And there's a wheat field there. George, I think his name was George Rose, but anyway, the Rose wheat field. And the soldiers, there's woods surrounding the wheat field, and the soldiers would come out of the woods from different directions, and it was an awful battle, perhaps one of the bloodiest battles in the whole Civil War, single battle. But it lasted, say, from in the late afternoon, 5 o'clock till dark. And at dark, the soldiers retreated both sides into the woods. And I guess they had, I guess you would call it a bivouac or a camp. And that night, George Hillier, in his book, he said one of the Confederate soldiers, it was quiet night, July 2nd, 1863, after the battle, and there's men still left in the field, wounded, dying, dead. And one of the Confederate soldiers started to sing this song, "When the Cruel War Is Over." And it was so quiet, everybody could hear. The Yankees could hear, the Confederates could hear, and all the soldiers, both sides, at the end of the song, they all clapped. And I thought it was such a it really it's a moving statement about the battle and how these soldiers just a few hours earlier were killing each other, and now they all agree with this song, and they show that by clapping, you know. And so really, I don't know. Would you say they're enemies? Yeah, they were for a while, but then they all had one thing in common.
Yeah. So I've deployed. I've written letters. And really, it's not, my generation is the last like letter writing generation. I'm 55 years old, not the oldest guy in the world, but been around for more than half a century now.
Right.
And when you write these letters, there is quite a bit of emotion you're trying to convey, and you're trying to tell all these different things, goings on of the day, what you're thinking about. But when you write something like the date on a letter, like it never meant anything really to me before, other than like schoolwork, so the teacher knew that like, oh, you wrote this thing yesterday, whatever.
Right.
But now you think this letter might be kept, and I don't know who I'm writing to. Yes, I'm writing to my auntie, or I'm writing to my dad, or whomever it is that you're writing to. But there is, that like this is something that someone is going to keep. You might die. You're doing this incredible thing. People are proud of you. And that little piece of paper becomes something much larger than just, hey, I wanted to check in, tell you that the food here is pretty good. It's really cold outside, our wet weather gear, whatever, right? Like all these things that you find, I always try to write, like, this is interesting to me, like in terms of like my version of culture shock of being in a combat situation. And in my case, I'm going into town every day because I'm a spy. So I'm talking to people. I have these rich things. But even just to explain that, I have to explain the context of the day. So I guess it's a long way of saying, when I'm writing that letter, and I'm sitting down and I'm slowing my world down, there's quite a bit that I'd never considered before that goes into that letter. And I sent letters all over the place. So who knows if anybody kept them, and they certainly wouldn't be gathered back together. That'd be impossible. But those letters had a lot of emotion and reality, and you're downloading the day. Oh my gosh, there's just so much in them.
Yes. Yeah. There sure is. And well, that's where I got the title, Remember Me. He mentions different times in his letters that he wants people to remember him. And these letters, you could feel how important they were for him. The letters he received, he wanted to hear from the people back home, and he wanted this contact. And the sad part that at the end of the letters, of course, was that in a way he had been forgotten. He had been forgotten. There's no grave for him. He's part of the dirt of Gettysburg Park. And after 10 years after the war, there was an attempt. They exhumed many bodies, the Confederates. They hired some men to go up there and paid them $1.50 for every body they could find. And they put them in wagons and took them back to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. But many of the soldiers were just left there. They're part of the soil. And, in his letters, I could feel at the beginning, the first letter, he's really gung-ho with this whole idea. And then as it goes along, it's 2 years of letters. And I think he was getting discouraged at the end. And he I think his big thing was he wanted to be remembered. And I thought this was appropriate to remember him with this book. And anybody that reads it, I hope they can see how this was an awful time in our history, and we shouldn't. I don't think it's worthwhile to do this again. Anything like it.
Yeah, I'll say, it's when you are faced with other people's mortality, like those guys have been at that point, 2 years on the trail. This is hard living, and you at some point accept either I will make it through this thing, but I shouldn't expect to. And doesn't matter if I'm standing here, there, or somewhere else. You get real. You start to understand that if there's a God, he's just picking, and he's not picking because they're good or bad. He's just picking because I need 10 right here, and they're gone.
Right.
And so you realize that you can be the best warrior in the world. It means nothing to the war dragon. It just chooses who it chooses. I mean, it chooses you 10 years from now. You're like, yeah, this is a war wound. I'm taking you. And that definitely comes through when you see that evolution. As when I read the book, we are proud when we're young men. Like, I've got to go do this. I'm going to prove up. Well, you prove up pretty quick.
Yeah.
Okay, I know how to stand here and hold this flag, or build this wall, or whatever it is. I know how to do that. I don't have to prove that anymore. And then it's just a matter of realizing, like, I probably won't make it out of here. I certainly shouldn't expect to.
Right. What that other book I was telling you about, George Hillier's fight that day. Now the captains had all died at the battle, so he was that was a battlefield commission, I guess. He became captain because the other captains were killed, and he was in a low spot in a creek bed with his men, and so the bullets were flying over them. And I understand a lot more about the Civil War and how these battles happened, but one of the first things, when the shots opened up, there was smoke all over the place, and you couldn't see anything. Sometimes you don't even know where you're at or which direction you're to go in or anything like that. So it's quite confusing. And George said he was down in the creek bed, and he could see there was about 1 foot of clear space across the battlefield. You could only see legs, and they were shooting at legs, and he could feel the bullets going over his head. I think he called it a sheet of lead. But at one point, the smoke cleared away, and he saw a Yankee flag bearer. And he says in his book, this young kid looked so brave and handsome, but it was my job to kill him, to shoot him. And so his whole crew there in the creek bed fired, and the smoke covered the battlefield again. And then when the smoke cleared again, he said the young man was gone. And he said in his heart he was hoping he got away. But that was the man he was supposed to kill. But he was hoping he got away. And that says a lot, I think, about what these men were up against. It's not, they're their fellow countrymen. They're just on different sides. And that was another thing that, about the sides were drawn by states, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah.
Other people who wouldn't be there with you in that trench had decided that, this piece of land was more important than that one. Even if it's, somebody like one of their generals, even if it's Lee, who's like, we're going to fight it right here at Gettysburg, right?
Yeah.
He determines that. It means nothing to you. You had no reason to go to Gettysburg ever in your life, but someone else has brought you here. And again, like your relative ultimately passes away there.
Right. And, so the battle was 3 days.
Right.
The first, second, and third. And I guess on the fourth day, that's when the Confederates retreated and they went south. I believe the line was 17 miles long, and the Yankees were chasing them all the way. And the Confederates left behind anybody that couldn't walk or get out of the way, so even the wounded. And of course, all the dead were left scattered about the field, and they were buried where they fell pretty much, just for sanitary purposes. And, later, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address at the First National Cemetery, which is on the northeast corner of the park, kind of. And actually, they only buried Yankee, Union soldiers there. Although I understand there was a couple of Confederates that got buried there by accident. A lot of these men were blown in pieces, and I don't even know if they were identifiable, or I don't even know how they identified them, or they just maybe they found something on them that might have showed who they were. But the Confederates were all gone, the ones that could leave on the fourth day or so.
Yeah, and when we slow down long enough to realize what happens at that battle over those days, and then you hear the Gettysburg Address, boy, it takes on a different meaning. It's one thing to say those are powerful words written about a powerful place, but yeah, it gets to be a different thing. We can become not callous, but who has time to get that emotional about something that happened, 180 years ago? Like, whatever.
Yeah.
It's just you can't, or 160 years ago. It's hard to fathom, and when you do dive in and you read the letters and you hear people tell the tale, or you go to Gettysburg, and that land speaks to you. I mean, you've been there,
Yes.
like it's is it alive? It's spiritual for sure.
Sure. And I guess I don't know. You could argue, but I would think that the Civil War was probably in our country's life was probably the most traumatic experience for our country. And I think it's strange that I call it unresolved. I don't think the Civil War was really ever resolved. And I think the evidence of that is the fact that, for example, you see Confederate flags displayed around the country, and there's a lot of loose talk. And I don't know if people really understand the gravity of what they're talking about. This was a really traumatic experience.
Yeah.
I don't think we've resolved it. I don't think we've resolved the issue of slavery. There's so many things, and I think people and Americans in general need to really look at this. It needs to be taught more about what happened, and we need to get over this somehow. I don't know the exact way, but it's not by uh, waving the Confederate flag to in defiance of something here today. That's my thought. I don't agree with that. I think uh, I think we really need to have some therapy, in our country.
Yeah, it's we continue to be just a rolling gunfight of a country. We have tons of freedom. You can do amazing things here, but we have to disagree about a lot of stuff. We don't make decisions easily. Once we make one, we race forward, and that decision is over most of the time. But you're right. There's a lot of debris left, and yet it's still remarkable. I mean, how many uprisings, we'll call that, of that size and scope are quelled and don't turn into fracturing of a state or decades and decades of banditry and rebel rousing. Like that's pretty much after Appomattox. Pretty much, it was over, and that is a very rare thing, I think, in history.
Yeah, but there's still something. I feel there's still something in our national consciousness.
And I think we agree on this too.
Yeah, and overall, I think that there was more Americans killed in the Civil War than all the other wars we've ever fought combined. And
that's right.
But when you look at the Second World War, I think it's arguable, but maybe 70 million people were killed in the world, and we were very fortunate to not have many at all and actually win the war we didn't have an invasion here, nor did we have the losses like the Russians, for example. And they're, I guess I wasn't over there in Europe, but I guess most of Europe was in shambles, and we're still a warring nation, and I don't understand. There's so many people that get lost in these wars forever. Their stories forgotten, and it's very sad, And I think we should. I don't know all the answers, but I think we really need to reflect on what all this means and the gravity of declaring war and creating something drastic like that.
Yeah. If 2% of our male population was wiped out in the next 3 years through internal combat, we would have a sense of what that was, because that's basically what it was. Yeah, give or take 700,000 people died.
Right.
And by people, I mean primarily dudes. And a lot of them intra-family, where you lose someone because someone takes one side over the other. And I agree with you that the Civil War is deeply rooted in slavery and our national struggle to deal with that. But what folks don't understand is you don't get to pick standing on the right side of history. Like if you're Lee and you think of your state first as what represents you, not a nation, and you take that direction. I'm not forgiving any kind of anything with Lee, but that's a reasonable position to be in. The government is taking a position against us. We must push back. And the next thing you know, you're in this war. And we struggle with that reality that just because there's a side and history turns out was right in that direction, doesn't mean that people in that time all had the ability to make that choice.
That's right.
It's asking a lot from some kid from South Alabama to stand up haughty and mighty and be like, this is the wrong side of history. I'm going north.
Well, that would have been a real hero. I mean, that would take a lot of
right.
bravery to stand up in the South and say, I don't agree with the Confederacy.
Yeah.
I don't know how many people did that. I'm certain there was some, and there always is, but they may have gotten hung too.
Yeah.
It's that's a pretty strong stand, and Robert E. Lee. I was raised a couple miles from his house, and I'd been there a few times as a child, and he had a mansion there that overlooks the city of Washington, D.C., right over the bridge.
Beautiful. Yeah.
That's where John F. Kennedy's buried. That's Arlington Cemetery now. So during the war, the Yankees took possession of that land, and they told him, if you want to keep your land, you got to come pay your taxes in person.
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't going to do that. So they took the land, and just to, I guess, punish him a bit, they started burying soldiers in his front yard. That's now Arlington Cemetery. I've heard another story too, that after the war, Lee's, maybe it was his son or maybe his grandson, but he sued the government to get the property back, and his lawyer was Abraham Lincoln's son. That's what I've heard. I don't know if
yeah,
that's...
I think that is true. Yeah.
You hear all kinds of things. We heard a lot about this, and I lived in Arlington in the centennial of the Civil War, and that was a really big event, 100-year celebration of the Civil War. Imagine that. And they used to have these little cards that I could buy at the corner market in Arlington. They were Civil War news cards. And they were I thought I was fascinated with them, and they cost a nickel. You get 5 and a piece of gum. Topps company made them. And they, as a kid, I thought, wow, this is really neat, this war, but there's much more to it, and sure. I've never experienced war, so I don't really know, but I know that it's more than some glory day or anything like that, you know.
This is a great like part of the conversation here too, because I'm trying to be delicate with what I say, because I'm in no way justifying slavery, right? Like we have to say all these things, and quite often our foreign policy and American policy, we just sort of snap a chalk line. Anybody who's on this side's a bad person.
That's right.
Anybody on that side's right. It's
Right.
like that's just not how that works. But that's what happens. And so good people on both sides get swept up into a war. Bad people on both sides get swept up into a war. And fortunes are made, fortunes are lost, and it's awful. And so look, and I'm not a lawyer, but I can say I imagine that if Abraham's kid, I think was that Todd, if he was the one that represented Lee in court, guaranteed there's a legal argument to be made. You might lose that legal argument, but you're going to point to precedent and be like, hey, by the way, you can't take this land. And the tax bill was, whatever it was, right? There will be an argument to make because everyone has rights. And this is one of the great things about our country. It makes it impossible to get things done sometimes, but everyone does have rights. So even if you have this rebellion and you're like, hey, we still want to be, because Lincoln was all about preserving the Union and bringing things back, there has to be grace on both sides. We struggle with that. We struggle with grace and saying, you know what, we're going to forgive and we're going to move on. And I think you're right. We, to this day, and maybe we're not supposed to figure out how to solve it and figure it out. And we're compelled to try to do the right thing in something that there is no right thing.
Well, I think there is a right thing, but I think we tend to play semantics and rationalize what we want to be right. What we want to be right sometimes more than, in regards to like human rights, for example.
Sure.
I mean, it's clear if you, what is it? All men are created equal. And, that's part of Christianity, I would say. I mean, they don't state it in that term, but, and just general good conduct is, treat others well, like you want to be treated. But we, any act of violence, I think it starts with dehumanization.
Sure.
Yeah. And so somehow we have to rationalize the taking of another life. And the other part is that these young men, I guess they were mainly men, there may have been some women too, but they were put up on the altar of sacrifice. Right. Not much different than when I was young. I learned about the ancient Aztecs or Mayans or Incas or whatever, and they, I was told they would take a young virgin and put them on the altar and cut their heart out, and this was to appease the gods and to spread prosperity and empower all the people. It seems kind of strange, but isn't that we've done that in a way? We've done that. We take these young people and we say, look, you're going to be a hero, and we want you to fight for our freedom and sacrifice. And if your life does get taken, we're going to give you a spot in our roll of honor. And
right.
But we make sacrifices with people.
Yeah.
And it's so really looking back, when I thought the Mayans and Aztecs were very primitive, I don't know if we're much more advanced.
Yeah. If we want to be hard on ourselves, that's certainly allowed. That's certainly a legitimate stance. And if you want to say, when the conquistadors came and they found things that they thought were barbaric and had to be barbaric to stop it, and to bring this part of the world into modernity, whatever that means, then yeah, you could say that too. Because this is life. This is a reality. One of the questions I love to ask, and I have like foreign policy type shows, because it's just a great question is, when you look at the Civil War, when does the politics stop and the conflict
politics
begin?
what?
When does politics stop being the reason for the thing, and when does the conflict begin, right? So if we say, well, slavery's bad and it's black and white, okay, great, but there's political stuff in there. There's influence. There's people vying for other people's well-being, land, products, whatever it's going to be. There's all this other stuff that's mixed into this issue of slavery, right? Which maybe you have to have a war to stop slavery, and that seems to have been mostly successful here, but not in all the world. And then you have all of the treatment of politicians towards one another. Like when we can't even form a nation unless we decide that black men are worth 3/5 of a vote. And otherwise there's not even a nation. Like there's no agreement, right? So that's a brokered deal to go, how do we deal with this? We don't know. Let's kick the ball down the road. And it sounds like this horrible thing, but if you don't even have a nation, then what happens? Do we just fight each other to death until there's just a bunch of roving bands of people that are part Indian, part American, part Spanish, part French? It's hard to know.
Well, after thinking and studying, I'm not an expert, but I've studied a lot and read a lot about this war. And I think there was, on the surface, it sounds good. Like, we're going to fight a war for democracy. So we're going to fight a war against slavery.
Right.
And, but beneath that, I think there's many underlying currents going on, such as the relationship between the North and the South. And in a way, and it's still prevalent. I would say that the Southern United States is still subject to the rest of the United States in many ways. The laws are in favor of big business more so in the South than in the West or the North. And back then, one of the big manufacturing products, was cotton. And the cotton mills were in England, I believe, Europe. There was some cotton mills in the northern states, but the northern states were kind of taking advantage of the southern states producing this cotton. So and then again, the landowners that owned the plantations were taking advantage of the slaves. So there's a hierarchy, and this cotton business, there was all kinds of clothing. I don't know everything they made of cotton, but it was a very important industry, and the people that were behind it were probably well removed from our country in the fact that they had so much money and power. And that was another probably important reason that we had the Civil War. There was so I don't think it, but then, it's hard to rationalize. We're fighting to keep this system going, this cotton system, and the slaves were part of it. But the broader picture was it was an exploitative system that exploited the people who grew the cotton for the people that manufactured it into finished goods. So there was a lot of things going on, and it's very complex. It's probably as complex as any war or thing we have going on today, which they're not, we didn't just run over to Iraq for just democracy. There's more. Yeah, right. But I think it's important to look at the whole picture if you can, and we may not even be able to, because there may be some things underlying beneath that, and that we don't even know.
There's a lot of things like that. I've had the good fortune to drive around this nation quite a lot, and it's lovely. There's great people out there. But when you drive through the South, you recognize that the South is I'll just say, like, largely dying. You can drive to Selma, this home of civil rights, this giant, the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You can walk up to that thing, and if you look behind the Edmund Pettus Bridge, you realize there's no money in this town.
There's
There's
no
no
money.
gas station in that town.
That's right.
You know, there's ruins on Main Street.
Right.
Ruins. And so when you see that, you're like, what is going on here, right? And there is some national culpability. There is some regional culpability, of course, but you know, do they have to have a big plant come and sit one county away so that people can get enough jobs to have jobs to support those jobs to support those jobs? Yeah, maybe. But where did all the money go? Where did all the help go? Why is it the 2020s and you still can drive to the south and be like, what on earth happened here? And I've been on one of those roads, and you probably have been on these too, Benny, but like when you're driving and all of a sudden it makes a hard left turn and it goes away from a place. And then I'm like, why did that happen? Why was there this? Because there's no reason for this road not to go straight.
Right.
And then you read about, oh, there was this act and so wouldn't cooperate. And so when you hit that county line,
the landowner. Right.
Yep.
I've been on those roads, sure.
Right. And you realize, oh, that's political.
Yes, it is.
They tried to starve this town out, you know, and oh my God, it's crazy. And what I'm describing here, just for anybody watching, like the road will still continue, but the route changes.
That's right.
And so if you drive straight on that road, like literally sometimes the road is like, oh no, what happened to this road?
Yeah,
it's just a wasteland in a lot of cases. So for all of this, like we won the war and the North won, they treated Black people like shit. You know, they weren't free. They still had to go do things. The North wasn't able to enforce it. So you're right. There's a lot of critique to be had, and that the legacy that still exists today.
Right. Yeah. And there, you know, the world we live in, you know, I would say it thrives on this exploitative economy. And you know, I always get a kick out of when a politician or a company calls themselves job creators.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's no company. I've never heard of a company in my life that is a job creation company. It sounds ludicrous when you really think about it. And there's I don't believe there's any course of study in college or university that teaches job creation. You know, it's kind of a bogus. Really, what they're saying is we want to come in here and exploit and whatever the labor, the minerals, the resources, and as a result of this, we're going to create some jobs. It's a byproduct of what we're offering to do, and this, you know, so that type of economy we still have it. You know, we still have this exploitative economy, and a lot of people get left out, you know, and no matter, another thing that you know, we have a lot of myths in this country that I don't agree with. I think they're myths anyway, like meritocracy, you know, or I've had a lot of jobs in my life. And I can remember a couple times when, you know, I was giving it all I could do, and then the brother-in-law of the owner shows up, and he's never worked there a day in his life, but he's put in charge of me and everybody else. And I'm thinking, well, it's funny how he was so meritorious, and he never worked here, but yeah.
I remember that lesson. I learned that at CDW. We always hire from within. Okay, but you just hired a dude from outside.
Yeah, right.
I'm paying attention. And then you say we're like family, but you told that person to put their shit in their box and you walked them out the door, and we never heard about that person again.
Right.
You know? And that person's got bills and everything else. Yeah. And I've got a lot of friends who have been on the other side of the decision. Well, we're going to cut back people. You know, good luck. You got 6 months worth of pay. 6 months. You know how long it takes to find a good job? Oh my God. You know, and you're right. Let's get back into the book a little bit.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you, when you were writing, are you writing to and I don't know, I forget how old your uncle was, but are you writing to an 18-year-old kid, like someone who's seasoned in life, like we both are? Or are you writing to an uncle? Like, what's the level of respect, I guess, that you're paying him?
Well, you know, he was 22 or 20 when he went in 22 at Gettysburg. And So I think, after reading his letter, number one, he was pretty educated. He was the first sergeant in his company.
Okay.
That's the highest rank of an enlisted man, and so he, in a way, was the liaison between the enlisted men and the commissioned officers. And he was secretary of the company for a while, and he knew how to write, and he frankly, he probably spoke better than I speak. I got to imagine back in those days, they had no internet, no television, and so he was a young man that was interested in learning. And I think the family expected that he would become a lawyer, so he never got that opportunity. He never got to finish college or anything. But I have a lot of respect, just his use of words and vocabulary, and I believe the letters were written before we had an actual dictionary and proper way of spelling words. So everything was phonetically spelt much, and I left it that way. So to emphasize that, I thought that was important, leaving the words the way he spelled them, like he spelled wear, like wear clothes. He spelled it W-A-R-E.
Right.
And things like
well,
that.
You can't know something's a homonym if there's no legit way to spell it. It's just like, like, I don't know, just these are the letters, right? Yeah.
Right. So I had, I got to have a lot of respect after reading the letters. I mean, I would say that he was at college level of a person. He had a really good education. You can tell by the way he described things and he wrote things. He must have read a lot and did his studies well. And I've read other letters too from the Civil War, and I guess letter writing was like the internet, so you had to do things good to get your idea out there and to understand someone else's idea. Communication.
Yeah. There was a level of memory, developed memory, that doesn't exist today commonly like it did then. Because if you didn't pay attention to what the pastor said, to what Lincoln said, they lost it forever. And so there were people that could write down verbatim whole passages of things, because it seems impossible now, right? Because you just look it up later on. Oh yeah, I got those. But it was absolutely possible back then. You read the news writing of the time, and it's remarkable the clarity that they write these things. And then it's not just here. It's like, oh, the same article, different articles, same story from different authors, same quote.
Right.
And these guys don't know each other.
No.
But or maybe they know each other, but
yeah.
And you're just like, wow, that's remarkable.
It is. And you know what? I read those. I don't know how many times I read those letters, and I really spent a lot of time. I thought it was. I didn't think it would take that long, but I'll bet I spent I might have spent 120 hours going over the letters, and he didn't use periods so much to end the sentence. And so you had to read it twice or three times to understand. Here's one idea, and here's another sentence without the periods. And I got as I was reading them for the second time, third time, there were new things that I discovered in the letters. I can't remember any in particular, but well, one of the letters he was talking about, he wrote, I think he wrote BUMS.
Okay.
Or maybe it was an O, and it was hard sometimes to look and see if it was a U or an O, because he didn't close them up all the time or whatever. But he says they're throwing bums out of Washington, D.C. into Alexandria. And I'm thinking, bums? What do you mean they're throwing bums? I had to read it a couple times. Then I said, oh, he's talking about bombs. they're throwing bombs. You see, and but I think that's what he meant. That's what I believe he was talking about. But maybe they were throwing bums too, bums and bombs. I don't. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the language, it's a different dialect of English, right? That they're speaking, and so not all the words cross over. And for sure, if you want to go get confused about Elizabethan English, go read some books from that time, and you're like, I have no idea what that is read. I know every word, but the colloquial part is really quite different. 100 and something years later.
Yeah, there was some things that I just wasn't even able to figure out exactly. But you're right, and they were maybe a contemporary colloquialism or something. And the other thing, his father was the first, I guess he was the first generation to be born in Georgia. And I think he was born in 1807 or something. I don't have it right in front of me. Now, the family came from Virginia. They moved to Virginia from Massachusetts, as I understand. So they landed in Massachusetts. They moved to Virginia. We're kind of a nomadic family, I guess. So they moved to Georgia. There was a land lottery, and the Indians were removed from Georgia, and they wanted white settlers to come there, and they had land lotteries. And so his father's father won some land, and they moved to Georgia from Virginia. And I don't even know why they left Great Britain. I don't know exactly, but I do have a lot of records about moving around and about the family, which is nice. A lot of my family were school teachers, so they like to keep journals and things, and I have some of those journals. Okay, so I know a little bit.
Yeah, it's remarkable. Part of my family tree, which when you look at like exponential growth of a family, you realize just how interconnected we are. You and I are cousins 100% for sure. I don't even got to know that just because I know the numbers. Just based on the numbers, there's going to be, and we're not well related, we may not even share any DNA, right? But it's not a very big place.
I'll tell you, I have a relative that has your name, Turner.
Oh yeah, see, there you go. And I'm not even really a Turner. I'm adopted on that name. So, but I am a Norton, and a bunch of other names. And because we think patrilineally, no one else cares about this. You have this one line that goes back for your family, but the rest of your family has names. And so you don't think of yourself as being an Olsen, even though your Olsen line might go back to here. And then also it's over here. And also it's over here. It's funny how we just think about that one branch, maybe the mom side a little bit, but we don't realize there's a whole internal fan of people that comprise who we are. And it's amazing. So when you think about a place like, if you've got family in Georgia, I'm sure I have family in Georgia, and I have family in Virginia. And, we had people come over on the Mayflower. We have Swedes that came in from Sweden. And you do wonder, like, what was it well, I want to see the ad that made my great-great-great-grandfather to go, I'm leaving Sweden and I'm going to Minnesota, and then.
I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. And another thing I think about with like the colloquialisms, we're so connected now nationally, worldwide. But back then, unless you had the means and desire to read a newspaper, your world was really small. It was really small. Even if you lived in a big city, it was really small because you couldn't move as much. You spent a lot of time working. People don't understand how much people used to have to work.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that you brought that up. That's interesting because he was from Talbot County, Georgia. Okay. And it was a very prosperous place, a cotton growing place. And his whole company, the name of their company, which was part of the 9th Regiment, was the Talbot Guards. So everybody in the company was from Talbot County. So probably everybody in the company either knew each other or they knew about each other. And the other interesting thing is that in those days, his unit, his company, they elected their officers.
Right.
So it's very, I don't think they would go for that today. But because, what if the men make a bad selection? What are we going to do then?
Right.
But the whole idea of democracy is the freedom to make a bad selection in one way. But so the officers were the most popular guys, the most popular men. And I think the first officer was Captain Goulding, and he died after a year on the field. And he was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. And I guess the men looked up to him as a leader because he had fought in a war before.
Mm.
But I thought that was interesting. I wonder how that would go today in the Army. We're going to elect the captain of this unit.
Yeah.
So you buy
It's
all your men beers, all your buddies beer, and you say, "Look, vote for me, free beer for a
yeah,
day."
vote for me. Yeah, and follow me, right?
Yeah, right.
And here's the thing that people don't realize about military, especially back then, is if you are a commander, your job is to get into if you're that kind of commander, like if you're a quartermaster or an engineer, there's different things, right? But if you're an infantry commander, your job is to get into the fight and to get the hardest fight of all. You're not there to protect your men, you're there to win. And who can better win than my men? And so when you pick that dude, his job is to go, I'm going to go bug the general until he puts us right in the middle. But it's like, wait, what? Yeah, that's what you're voting for, and that's what they wanted, right? And so when you're writing to this kid, at least at first, he's like, yeah, let's do it. And then he promotes partly because he survives, partly because he's educated.
Yeah.
And he becomes the first sergeant, and maybe he had his eye on maybe becoming a lieutenant or a battlefield colonel or something like that, because that certainly happened. But he doesn't survive the war. If he survives the war, he didn't have too far to go. Still might have died in one of the many battles that were left. But what do you think he would have been? Do you think he would have become a lawyer? What's your sense of him?
Yeah, I think he would. He probably would have become a politician or a lawyer or something like that. And
Yeah.
a lot of the soldiers returned and became teachers, lawyers, politicians. Bank presidents.
Right.
He was a part of Anderson's brigade, and Anderson lived after the war. I forgot what he became, but a lot of these guys were rewarded with nice jobs, I think. And even though they lost the war, so I wouldn't even be here. See, Chris Kendrick, my great uncle, was supposed to be married to a lady named Levice Maddox, and I believe they're the Maddox family of Lester Maddox, the Georgia governor long back in the 60s. But Levice Maddox married my great grandfather. So Chris had 6 brothers and brother-in-laws. They all lived on the plantation there, and they all fought in the war. One of them was my great grandfather, and he when he returned from the war, he was about a year younger than Chris, and he returned and he married Levice Maddox, Chris's fiance. And so I wouldn't even be here. It's strange how things work out like that.
Yeah, it is it is strange, and the times when like the aunt is really the mom because of survival,
Yeah,
and it's like, hey, I've got this good job, but I've got to go move to Idaho, and then I'll send money home, so you're mom now.
exactly.
You
Right.
know? Yeah, we get really precious with like what we think our lineage is, but you dig in, you're like, oh my God, I'm just a mix of parts and people trying to survive. And this guy made it for 20 years and then it all fell apart. It's crazy the amount of chaos and death that followed families. And when you read about it, whether it's in your own history of your own family, or you just look at it, and living to 45 was hard. You know, like when I talk about people like to put baseball players. I love baseball, and they like to put them in a time machine and say, "Oh, well, if Otani played back in Babe Ruth's time, he'd hit 1,000,000 home runs or something like that." And I'm like, yeah, it's 1 in 4 that a kid born in 1895 when Babe Ruth was born, 1 in 4 dead. You know, and like these are long odds. No internal heating, and if it is, it's in a boiler that could blow up at any time if your dad isn't constantly down there managing it. It's a machine that you have to constantly, all of these things. Your diet is lard and flour, and like it's hard to survive.
They were eating raw bacon one day when they got hit by a bomb from a ship, a Union ship.
Oh my God!
And he says, "I'll never eat, raw bacon in a barn," or something like that in his letter.
Yeah. I was struck. So I was reading my grandfather's letters, and I was struck by the level of immaturity. He's early 20s, right? And he's going through this military training. No matter what you're doing, no matter how cool your job is quite often boring. And it's remarkable that if you were born in this little 5-year window, you could become a pilot in World War II.
That's right.
If you're on either edge of the window, they didn't move fast enough to get you into the fight. So you would start, but and that's it. Then it's over. You don't really get to go in after that. So my grandfather's at the very end of when they were actively trying to push people forward, but at a slower rate. He's like, well, how come we don't work on Sundays? And so I asked this archivist, he's like, because they didn't want as many pilots. They wanted to give these guys who had been working 7 days, they wanted to give them a day off. And so, your grandfather is chomping at the bit, trying to get through training. And these other guys are finally getting a break. And so that push and pull of the consumption of manpower, and all these things that have to happen. If you get sick, you stayed in the hospital for months. Now you got to recover from being in the hospital from all these things that happen. It's a fascinating world. And I really appreciate you writing about your family's history. I really enjoyed reading the book. And I mean this next part in a good way. I really struggled with your conversations that you had with your uncle, because there's enough emotion in that, and there's enough knowledge in that. You're like, wow, you picked those things to say, because you're challenging him a lot of the times in the book. You're like, hey, like this is what you're doing. And I found that to be a really a wonderful journal, wonderful journey. And just, I don't need everything I read to be comfortable. And you did a wonderful job of making me sit with things that are hard to sit with and have to kind of read through them. And it really, I enjoyed that probably the most about it. And I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed that about the book. It's about a struggle, right? And a struggle that we're still having. And you did a great job of expressing that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It was nice to be on your show. Break it down, right?
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah.
Any questions for me before we wrap this thing up?
No, that's good. If anybody wants to get the book, they can get the book on line. Just remember me, Benjamin Kendrick Buckley. And
the link, everybody, is right there.
The book right there.
There it is. There's the book right there. Yeah, and the link is down below. And you guys all know what I think. Buy two, buddy, read it. Buy two, buddy, read, and just talk about it, because there's a lot of great things to ask about. And heck, if you want to ask me, I've read the book now, so you can ask me like, hey, what is this like when it comes to war? I'm glad to talk to you about that. So everybody should definitely get the book, check it out, support Benjamin's work. And when you get another book written, Benjamin, come right back on the show. I'd love to talk to you.
Well, that's great. Thank you. I'm working on something. All right. That'll be great. Perfect. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Stand by 1 second. Let me stop this thing. Everybody else, I'll see you.